Good day. The first thing I need to do is to say that is to apologise for the fact that there was no video update from me yesterday. Briefly, the reason is that one of my two daughters was taken ill, and I had to deal with that. I'm glad to say that she's now much better, and the result is that I'm able to make videos today. The second is to say that with every hour almost, it seems that the catastrophe that has struck Turkey and Syria grows worse. The death toll from the earthquake that I'm now seeing numbers around 17,000. This is a cataclysmically appalling event, and one which I have to say has shaken me, and I haven't seen a death toll from an earthquake on this scale for a very, very long time. Always when one is discussing this topic, this kind of topic, one thinks of the families of the people who have died, and one thinks about their distress, and one thinks also of the many other people who are there and who are homeless or in need of help, and one does hope that everything possible is being done to help them. I noticed that President Erdogan has been touring the area. I'm not going to discuss in this program. I still feel that at a time when a humanitarian operation is underway, that it would be inappropriate to talk about the political consequences of this earthquake, even though obviously what happens in Turkey is of very great significance indeed. Anyway, I will now move on to the topic that has dominated this channel, since before February last year, which is the crisis in East-West relations and the crisis in Ukraine, the military crisis that is ongoing at the moment in Ukraine. And as I traditionally do, I'm going to provide an update about the military situation. However, before I do, I will say that once again, we've had reports of a major missile strike by the Russians on Ukraine. And once again, this was an extremely complex affair. Reports that uranium-2 drones were again used in large numbers after an interval. Also reports that ballistic missiles were launched at targets across Ukraine. And there are some reports now, by the way, which suggest that these are old S-300 surface-to-air missiles that have been adapted to attack ground targets. I can't remotely start to confirm that. But anyway, there's been reports of this, and we'll see whether or not we'll find out in time whether this was true. And also cruise missile strikes. There was at least one wave of cruise missile strikes, which apparently numbered around 40 cruise missiles. Apparently, more waves have either followed or are expected. It seems clear to me that this attack is still underway, even though it has been going on now for several hours, started in the night and continues over the course of the day. I think that it's better always to talk about these missile strikes after the dust has settled, metaphorically speaking, of course, and to discuss what the impact of these strikes was and what their purpose was. So I'm going to defer that until my next video. In the meantime, let's talk about the general military situation. And in my previous video 2 days ago, I spoke about a rapid deterioration of the position of Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut. And that appears to be continuing, and at least one Russian official is now claiming that the village of Krasnaya Gora, located close to one of the main roads leading into Bakhmut, has now been captured, and that the Russians are pressing on in other places, and that they're also have all of the main roads under fire control. In other words, they're able to shell them, which is essentially what the British Ministry of Defence was reporting a couple of days ago. The official in question is Igor Kimakovsky, an advisor to the acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic. And this is what he is reported to have told TASS early this morning, that is to say, early this morning on the 10th of February. The liberation of Krasnaya Gora has been announced, which makes it clear that all roads are now within our firing range. By the way, he means not just the road that leads through Chasov Yar and Ivanovka into Bakhmut. That road has been actually cut, apparently, by the Russians in several places. It seems that the Wagner assault forces are in actual physical occupation of part of that road. More about that in a moment. But also the northern road, the one from Konstantinovka, it seems that the Russians are now, having captured Krasnaya Gora, in a position to shell any Ukrainian troops or supplies that pass up and down this road. Anyway, to continue, clearly there aren't just main roads, and it's possible to move along forest belts and on rough tracks. So Ukrainian troops still have routes to deliver reserves, reinforcements, and ammunition. But it should be said that all roads are under the fire control of the Russian armed forces. And TASS then goes on to report, according to Kimakovsky, Ukrainian troops will soon be in an operational encirclement and will have to surrender Artyomovsk. He means, of course, Bakhmut. And acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic, Denis Pushilin, said earlier that fighting was raging in Bakhmut's neighborhoods that used to be controlled by the Ukrainian army. And in fact, again, about 2 days ago, I reported claims, or rather not claims, admissions by a Ukrainian soldier that there is not only fighting going on within Bakhmut itself, but around a third of the town is now under Russian control. Now, I have to say, this is one Russian official saying that Krasnaya Gora has been captured by the Russians, specifically by the assault forces of the Wagner organization. There are other reports which suggest that there is still fighting going on in Krasnaya Gora. But I have seen maps, always difficult for me to read maps. And by the way, I should say there are lots of different maps, Ukrainian maps, Russian maps. They all often place the front lines in different places. But the accumulation of information from all of these maps is that Krasnaya Gora is at the very least in the process of falling under Russian control. Even Ukrainian maps seem to show a significant part of this village now occupied by Russian forces. And they also seem to show the other village to the west of Krasnaya Gora, Paraskovyevke, has now been fully encircled or almost fully encircled by Russian forces. And that would suggest that the time frame before the fall of this village is now becoming shortened. If the Ukrainians decide to pull out of this village, it also looks like the only direction they can pull out towards now is Bakhmut itself, which I'm afraid would be a case of leaping out of the frying pan into the fire. In other words, they would be going from one encirclement into another, even larger encirclement. But anyway, I'm not going to get ahead of myself. It may be that things are more complicated than that. And coming back to what Kimakovsky says, there are still small forest pathways and dirt tracks, apparently, that the Ukrainians can use, and perhaps the garrison in Paraskovievka, under pressure as it appears to be, might be able to use some of these tracks. Anyway, I'm not going to, as I said, leap ahead of myself. But if news for Ukraine or for the Ukrainian forces is becoming really extremely grave in the northern areas of Bakhmut, Krasnaya Gora and Paraskovievka are to the north of Bakhmut, it seems to be becoming critical, even more worse, if I can put it like that, in the southwestern areas of Bakhmut, with now confirmation that Russian forces have cut the road from Chasov Yar into Bakhmut. That's the road that passes through Ivanovka. Ivanovka itself is now under Russian attack. There are apparently fighting going on, at least on the boundaries of this village. But perhaps more importantly, there's also reports that the Russians have now reached the outskirts of the town of Chasov Yar, and it looks as if they are actually planning to capture Chasov Yar. And there are suggestions that the Russian objective is not to storm Ivanovka, but to storm Chasov Yar, a bigger place located to the west of Ivanovka, but one apparently that for various topographical reasons, which I'm not able to discuss, apparently it's a more difficult place to defend. It's a sort of rather dispersed place. It's very difficult to set up a centralized defense system in Chasov Yar. But the point is, if Chasov Yar is captured, it wouldn't just, of course, be Bakhmut, which would be cut off from road access to the west and the southwest, but whatever Ukrainian forces there are in Ivanovka would be cut off as well. So we are looking now, it seems to me, at not just the end game in Bakhmut, but possibly further evidence that the Russian plan here is not just to capture Bakhmut and to encircle the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, but to carry out a larger encirclement operation, which appears to be intended to encircle a lot of the Ukrainian troops who are supporting the defense of Bakhmut, and that this is the Russian objective, so that this pincer movement that we're seeing is not going to just take in Bakhmut itself, but these larger Ukrainian forces. Of course, it's not easy to say how many those forces are. A Ukrainian channel said that there are at least more than 6,000 to 7,000 Ukrainian troops in serious danger now of encirclement in the Bakhmut area. Other Russian sources put that much higher. Well, we'll see what happens. But that, it seems to me, does seem to be the overall plan. And by the way, on that point, I should say that I had a very interesting email from a person. He actually said that I was entitled to speak his name, though he did also say that many people find it difficult to pronounce his name. I'm not going to, actually. I think if I start giving away some names and not others, then this is going to create confusion. If it's somebody who everybody has heard of, I will mention it. But if it's private individuals, I'm not going to. But anyway, this particular person has pointed out that from a Russian point of view, given that Ukraine continues to send reinforcements constantly into this gathering cauldron in Bakhmut, it might actually be in their interests to keep the cauldron, the trap around Bakhmut, open so that Ukraine can continue to rush forces there. And that will simply increase the number of men and machines, Ukrainian men and machines, in the bag. Well, or in the cauldron, if you prefer. And that's certainly an interesting thought. And this person suggested that if that is the Russian tactic, then they have no reason to shut this cauldron down over the next couple of days, that this thing might actually go on much longer than that, because it plays to the Russian plan to trap, encircle, destroy as many Ukrainian troops as possible. Well, it's certainly a thought, and I'm not going to try and second guess whether it's right. It's the only thing I think I can do is pass it on. My own feeling is that the Russian command, the Russian military leadership, have made a decision now that this battle of Bakhmut has, in terms of destroying Ukrainian forces, it's achieved all that it realistically can. The time has come to bring this long battle for Bakhmut to an end in order to move on further west and to take more places. And again, I would reference that admission from a Ukrainian soldier given to the Western media, which I discussed in my video of 2 days ago, that if the Russians are able to take Bakhmut and the hills west of Bakhmut, which I suspect are all part of this bigger defense system, then they can put artillery on those hills. It would be overlooking Ukrainian positions in places like Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka and Slavyangrad, and the Russians would in effect be in control of the high ground, which would make the position of Ukrainian forces in these three towns, the last three important towns that Ukraine would still be controlling in this area of Donbass, that those three towns would find themselves under immense pressure, and the whole position of Ukraine might start to collapse in northern and central Donbass as the Ukrainian position in Lugansk region began to collapse after the Russian capture of Popasnaya. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say there. I personally sense that the Russians are moving to bring this battle in Bakhmut finally to an end. But, there are alternative views. This, it seems to me, is a valid alternative view, not one I agree with, and I'm passing it on. Now, we've had a demonstration of what control of the high ground means in what is an artillery war, and that's in relation to further fighting near Vuhledar. Yesterday, there was a whole stream of videos and claims from Ukrainian channels that the Russians have suffered a severe defeat near Vuhledar. I'm going to anticipate that in a few hours or days, we're going to see reports on this. The British Ministry of Defence will probably be recycling this news. There were claims that up to 400 Russian soldiers were killed in Vuhledar. The Ukrainians, by the way, have been going out of their way to talk up the fighting in Vuhledar, to suggest that the Russians are losing significant numbers of men and machines there, and they've been doing this for some time. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I've seen other Russian reports. I've also seen films. I've been able to compare the various reports. I've come to the view that there is a rather complicated Russian operation underway to move forward towards encircling Vuhledar, and that there were several Russian attacks around Vuhledar, some of which were successful in dislodging Ukrainian forces from their positions, but one of which was a failure and was pushed back. And the kernel of truth behind these Ukrainian reports of some heavy defeat for the Russians in Vuhledar is that it is those claims that it is the fact that one of these Russian attacks does appear to have been repelled, and that the Russians do seem to have suffered some losses over the course of that attack. However, it's also clear to me that the Ukrainians are counting some armoured vehicles, some Russian armoured vehicles, as destroyed, which actually pulled back. And I think that Ukrainian claims about hundreds of Russian soldiers being killed are almost certainly greatly exaggerated. I have to give a word of caution here because obviously I'm not a reporter on the ground. I can only compare what different sources are saying. But overall, I think that the Russians probably actually, contrary to what the Ukrainians are saying, probably gained ground around Vuhledar, even if one of their attacks failed, something which, by the way, is unsurprising in terms of this particular town. I'll come to that in a moment. But obviously they did suffer a reverse, but I don't think it has any enormous significance with respect to the fighting that's going on in and around Vuhledar itself. Now, I think one of the reasons why Vuhledar is difficult to capture is that Vuhledar itself is a fairly concentrated, dense town located on high ground, and it's got these big, tall apartment buildings, and it's on a sort of higher ground, so it means that the Ukrainians are able to keep an eye, they're able to track what Russian forces are doing. In the flat plains around, they have the advantage of being able to see what the Russians are doing, and of course they can concentrate their artillery fire. And I think that's probably what's happened in a number of cases, and why Vuhledar has been so difficult to encircle and capture. Now, if there were tens of thousands of Russian troops operating in this area, seeking to capture Vuhledar, I think that this battle would be very quickly over. But it's clear that there are not. Most of the fighting appears to be still the work of the Russian forces that have been operating in and around Vuhledar, well, for many months now. The Naval Infantry Brigade that's been relocated from the Far East, Alexander Khodorkovsky's Vostok force, which is part of the Donbass militia, highly trained and semi-professional, or perhaps fully professional outfit, by the way, and various supporting troops that the Russians have moved into this area. And this is a substantial force, but the Ukrainians have also moved considerable numbers of troops to Vuhledar, and it is this, together with the advantage given to the Ukrainians by the fact that Vuhledar is on higher ground, that makes its encirclement and capture so difficult. Now, Khodorkovsky was talking a few weeks ago about an encirclement of Vuhledar and came very close to saying, he didn't quite say that this was a done thing, but it didn't happen when he predicted, because the Ukrainians were able to rush reinforcements, weakening other parts of the battlefront. We're going to come to that shortly. And they were able to stabilize the situation in Vuhledar, as they have been able to stabilize the situation in Zaporozhye region. But if we're talking about Vuhledar, I come back to this point which I've made about Bakhmut. Yes, it's true that it takes the Russians longer to capture these places than some optimistic claims from Russian officials, and perhaps some comments which, I was making about Bakhmut earlier in the battle might have, suggested. But if Ukraine is paying a disproportionate cost in lives and machines to hold on to these places, which I think has definitely been the case in Bakhmut and is quite likely shaping up to be the situation in Vuhledar, then these are not victories by Ukraine, as far as I can see. They are rather further examples of Ukraine throwing away lives and machines to try to hold what are ultimately undefendable positions. And it works ultimately to the advantage of the Russians. Now, I would have thought this was obvious, but one person who is perhaps still the key decision maker in Ukraine, President Zelensky himself, doesn't seem to be willing to accept this logic. Now, over the course of his recent trip to London, about which more in a moment, President Zelensky once again repeated the now standard line that Bakhmut is of no great strategic significance. But then he also said that Bakhmut must be held up to the moment when the new Western equipment, the tanks, the long-range missiles, we'll come to all of that in a moment, perhaps the fighter jets, arrive. Now that's going to take weeks, months even. And the numbers of these Western machines is not going to be enough, or so it seems to me, to break through to Bakhmut. It reminds me very much of the kind of things that Zelensky was saying at the time of the encirclement of Ukrainian troops in Mariupol. He was constantly saying that, Mariupol must hold because Ukraine is going to launch a counterattack to relieve the Ukrainian troops in Mariupol. That counterattack never materialized, and eventually the garrison made their own decision and capitulated without receiving orders from him. It seems to me that this is all repeating itself all over again. Zelensky's inability to give up ground is sacrificing or throwing away the lives of his soldiers, holding places like Bakhmut and, I suspect before long, Vuhledar. It's not changing the direction of the war. It is weakening Ukraine. And it is concerning that he doesn't seem to grasp this. And I do wonder, actually, about the advice he's getting and who is providing him with this advice. But anyway, that's all I'm going to say. I don't want to talk about this further. We can see that, as I said, in Bakhmut, Russians are pressing forward. I think an encirclement is soon going to be underway, and we're going to be seeing, I think, perhaps a long battle for Vuhledar, longer than Khodorkovsky led us all to think a few weeks ago, but one where the direction of travel still seems to me to be very clear, and where I think the Russian attack is very much in earnest. Now, the Institute for the Study of War, not a source I often cite, if only because, for one thing, to be frank, it's not reporting from the ground. It's taking the same reports that I'm seeing and putting its own spin on them. But the Institute for the Study of War, Washington-based, neocon-oriented, the British Ministry of Defence, all of them are now talking about a huge Russian offensive in Kreminna, Svatovo, that sort of area. Now, I've been talking for some time about the fact that the Russians do seem to be making some kind of significant attack in this part of the world. And the Institute for the Study of War says that the Russians have now committed as many as 3 divisions to the battles in and around this area, and that explains the nature of the advances. And Ukrainian lead officials, including Sergei Gaidar, who is the Ukrainian governor of Lugansk region, says that Ukraine is coming under heavy pressure in this area, though Ukrainian defenses around Kreminna are holding. Well, is this actually so? Certainly the Russians have been piling on forces around this area, Kreminna, Svatovo. I've discussed how they seem to be moving steadily towards Kupiansk, and in fact there have been some more reports to that effect today. Again, they're not very reliable, and I'm going to skip discussing them for the moment. But are we really talking about an advance of 3 divisions, which would be a very significant force, perhaps 20,000 men in total? I have to say, I don't see it. I think that Gaidar's claims are contradicted by the fact that he says that Russian attacks are still taking place, involving relatively small numbers of troops, even though they are now becoming more and more frequent. It doesn't seem to me that we're looking at the big, enormous offensive that the Institute of the Study of War, some Ukrainian officials, before long I expect British officials, are talking about. I do wonder whether all these claims are partly intended to give the impression that Ukraine is successfully holding back a big Russian advance. Because I do think there will probably be accumulating pressure, and I do think the Russians probably do have Kupiansk at least in their sights. But I think that it is premature to talk about a big Russian advance in this area, at least on the kind of scale that the Ukrainians, the Institute for the Study of War, and others are talking about. But we do have now a flurry of reports about the scale of the Russian forces that are being concentrated and in and around Ukraine. And again, I'm reading, this is from the Foreign Policy magazine news website, and a Ukrainian military official is reported to have said that Russia now has more than 300,000 troops inside Ukraine. That, by the way, would include Donbass, which of course Ukraine considers to be Donbass. And this official says that's almost double the amount that were amassed on its water borders before the start of the war. And that the Russian military has also prepared 1,800 tanks, 3,950 armored vehicles, 2,700 artillery systems, 870 multiple rocket launch systems, 400 fighter jets, 300 helicopters, and this is a much bigger force than that which took part in the first wave, and that the Ukrainians are starting to worry that they may not have enough men to hold this force back. Well, all I would say is these are indeed the size of the Russian forces that have been concentrated already in Ukraine, and other Russian forces gathering around in reserves in Belarus. That doesn't include, it seems, the forces in Belarus. Perhaps another 100,000 men. Other Russian forces elsewhere. Well, that does put in perspective, again, the Western supplies of weapons that we've been hearing so much about. Now, Zelensky has been on a European tour. He went to Britain, where he met the king. He addressed Parliament. He's secured a promise for training of Ukrainian pilots. The pilots are apparently going to be trained on Typhoon fighter jets, which are just about the only fighter jets that the Royal Air Force now operates. Royal Air Force operates about 100 Typhoon fighter jets. There's been a rather acerbic comment that's appeared in the British media attributed to a British minister, in which this minister uses an expletive and says, what fighter jets? Britain doesn't have any spare fighter jets to give Ukraine. If these pilots are being trained on British fighter jets, Emmanuel Macron has apparently now publicly ruled out, supplying French fighter jets to Ukraine, says that this isn't a priority at the moment. I expect that the pressure will be on the Germans, who have more Typhoon fighter jets. If that's the aircraft that people are talking about, that the pressure will be on the Germans to supply some of those. The British apparently might supply some of the older, about 20 of their Typhoon fighter jets. The Royal Air Force would not be happy, but there's been some talk that this might happen. We'll see if it does. And even the British media have admitted that this would be nowhere near enough. And taking on the Russian air defense system with these fighter jets, these 20 Typhoons, would be nothing like enough. And perhaps the plan is to get the Germans, who are about 140 of these machines, more than the British, to supply some of them to Ukraine. I have to say, this looks like a wild idea to me, and there's talk that the Ukrainians could be trained to fly these things, completely different. These fighter jets, these Typhoon fighter jets, completely different, though they are from the MiG-29s and Sukhoi 27s that they themselves have operated, that they can be trained to fly them in 3 months. I have to say, we might find ourselves in that situation, and no doubt they could fly them, they could learn to fly them in 3 months. But flying aircraft of this complexity and sending them into battle, that seems to me to be a very, very different thing indeed. But that the British might indeed be thinking along these lines is suggested by something else, which is that the British are talking about supplying Ukraine with long-range missiles. And the one that's been talked about quite a lot is a 550-kilometer cruise missile. And that would be significantly longer range than the ATACMS missiles that we've been hearing so much about, and be a significantly large cruise missile, long-range cruise missile. But, there are two obvious problems with this idea. Yes, the British do have these cruise missiles, but apparently they're air-launched, and that's possibly what this Typhoon idea is all about. And secondly, I suspect that the British don't have large stocks of these things. So the idea apparently is a blitz with these missiles, primarily against Crimea, sometime in the summer, perhaps strikes against Moscow that I'm not sure that the range for these cruise missiles is big enough. All very reckless, all extremely irresponsible, all highly dangerous. And I wonder whether or not, again, the British aren't gambling and going out far on a limb. Now, those 20 fighter jets that we were talking about that the British might supply, they're apparently not adapted for launching these cruise missiles. They're apparently intended more for air-to-air combat. No doubt they could be adapted. That might slow down the process even more. But to be frank, this whole thing looks a little harebrained to me. Clearly, there is pressure within Britain to supply these fighter jets. Clearly, there is also opposition too, as that expletive-ridden comment from that British cabinet minister suggests. I'm going to make a guess that what we're seeing here is also the playing out of a row within the British military. There's been a string of reports recently that the British Army, heavily run down, seeing its self-propelled howitzers shipped en masse to Ukraine, short now of anti-tank missiles, having to part with 14 of its precious Challenger 2 tanks, that they're becoming increasingly resentful that Ukraine is being supplied with British Army equipment and that they now want the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy to start doing their share. So that's why we're hearing these reports about Typhoon fighter jet deliveries, about cruise missiles from the Royal Air Force, and Harpoon missiles, anti-ship missiles, supposedly to be converted to some kind of ground strike role from the Royal Navy. As I said, all of this looks harebrained to me, and all it's going to do, I don't think it's going to change the military picture to any substantive degree. There are missile strikes like this on Crimea. I think the Russians will absorb them. It will make the Russians even angrier with Britain than they already are. Perhaps the British don't care about that, but perhaps they should. But of course, in practical terms, it will mean that just as the British Army has now been weakened, and we've had reports, an accumulation of reports about this now in the British media, it seems that the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy is going to be weakened as well, giving up precious missiles, possibly precious aircraft, all of which are already in limited supply. I think it's time that the British acknowledged that they just don't have the number of weapons that Ukraine would need to make a significant difference on the battlefield, even if they could be supplied in the necessary time scale, and even if the Ukrainians could be trained to use these weapons, and that the British doing this thing is probably going to start irritating even more some of Britain's allies. Now, coming to that issue, there's been some really very interesting reports coming out of Europe. One of them, in the Financial Times, no less, admits that the European arms industries are unable to keep up with Ukraine's insatiable demands for 155mm ammunition. It's quite clear to me that the ammunition war has now been lost, that there's no conceivable way that the United States and Europe can provide Ukraine with enough supplies of 155mm ammunition. And that, I suspect, is going to have a growing impact on the battlefield over the next few weeks and months. But let's put that aside. There's also now political differences. Firstly, there's a flurry of reports, including one I read in the Daily Telegraph, that the relationship between the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, and the German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, has now, to all intents and purposes, broken down. It seems that Scholz absolutely did not want to supply Ukraine with tanks, German Leopard tanks. He is furious with the pressure Baerbock placed upon him to succumb to the pressure to provide these tanks. And it seems that he's also incredibly angry because Baerbock apparently intrigued with the leaders of other Western countries, with Tony Blinken, I suspect with the British as well, to try to get them to increase the pressure on Scholz to get him to deliver the tanks. And there's also stories that Baerbock has been going around poking fun at Scholz, cracking jokes about him. I don't know whether any of that is true, but anyway, doing things which, unsurprisingly, have left Scholz profoundly unamused. And it seems that the two, Scholz and Baerbock, are now barely on speaking terms. So that's one series of reports we're seeing. We've also had a meeting, just as Zelensky visited Britain, he also went to Brussels. He met with Scholz and Macron. That meeting doesn't seem to have gone especially well. Yes, Macron again talked about helping Ukraine to achieve victory, but he now seems to have ruled out the supply of fighter jets from France. And I get the sense that after the tank debacle, which I've discussed at inordinate length, I think the Germans, or at least Scholz, is now deeply unhappy and is trying to, this time, stick to his red line about fighter jets. Whether he'll be able to continue to do that is another matter. But we'll come to the pressures in Germany, the pressures which are building up in Germany shortly. So already tensions there. But that meeting between Scholz, Macron, and Zelensky has also led to a European row. Because one other European leader, Giorgia Meloni, was not the Prime Minister of Italy, was not invited. And she's apparently furious about this and is angrily complaining about the fact that she was excluded from this meeting. And that begs the question of why was she excluded? Now, one can speculate about all sorts of possible reasons, but I'm going to make a guess that it was an actual deliberate decision by Macron and Scholz not to have her come. And I think the reason they did that was because Meloni has proved an outspoken, extreme supporter of Zelensky and Ukraine, and of Italy supporting Ukraine. And this, in this, by the way, she's going against the feelings of some of her coalition partners, Berlusconi, Salvini, and the others. But at the moment, she's popular in Italy, and for the moment, she's able to keep this going in Italy itself, though with growing signs that Italy is under financial pressure and perhaps in recession. I wonder how long that's going to be sustained. But that's another issue to be discussed another day. Anyway, I wonder whether Macron and Scholz decided to keep Meloni away because they didn't want to find another European leader outspokenly supportive of Zelensky, coming along to a meeting like this, pushing France and Germany for weapons commitments to Ukraine that the Germans and the French at the moment are not keen upon. Just a guess, but we can perhaps start to see how the fissures are starting to grow. And I'm going to say something else. The Germans certainly, and the French probably, are keeping an eye on what's going on in Washington. And they will have noticed this cascade of reports, the Rand Corporation report, the CSIS report, the IMF report about the Russian economy. They will have kept their eye out on all of these things. They will know that there is now a debate going on in the United States about the wisdom of continuing to prosecute this war. And I wonder whether perhaps that is starting amongst some of these European leaders in Germany and in France. It's made them more wary about making their own commitments, open-ended commitments to Ukraine. Well, we will see. So the British trying to perhaps put pressure, especially on the Germans, to step up more military deliveries to Ukraine. It could be that this time they will find that the Germans, far from being as accommodating as they eventually turned out to be about the tanks, this time they're going to try and put their foot down. Now, whether that's successful or not, whether the Germans are able to hold the line is another matter. But one does sense that the stresses in Europe amongst the Western allies, the fissures, they've always been there, but they're starting to grow wider. It's notable, it's interesting that Austria, which after the fall of Sebastian Kurz had appeared to move totally to adopting the EU-NATO position on Russia and Ukraine, that Austria, under its current chancellor, under its current pro-NATO, pro-EU government, as many supposed, is now gravitating towards Hungary, that the Austrian Chancellor and the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, are now meeting, that they're agreeing that their countries will not be supplying arms to Ukraine. There's even some talk about Austria-Hungary, the old empire, reasserting itself in European councils. That might be going a bit far. But anyway, it does look as if the Austrians, perhaps never completely in for the ride, that doubts there and resistance there is starting to strengthen. We shall see. Anyway, there is one particular issue that perhaps is causing the greatest tensions and embarrassments at this moment. And that is the article by Seymour Hersh on the attack on Nord Stream. Now, can I say, in my video 2 days ago, I expressed my own belief that Seymour Hersh's account overall is true. I'm going to come to a few criticisms that have been made of it in a moment, but the last couple of hours have reinforced that belief. And the reason is that there have been denials from the US government about the truth of this report, about the truth of this article, but they've all come from middle-ranking spokespeople, from a White House spokesman, from, I believe, other departments as well. But importantly, none of the people who are supposed to have been involved in the decision making, none of the higher level decision makers seem to have come forward and straightforwardly said that Seymour Hersh's account is wrong. And the person who I would have expected to come forward and make such a denial, if this story was a complete fabrication or completely wrong, is William Burns, the CIA director, whose agency, it's clear, played the leading role, if you follow Hersh's article, in the attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines. If William Burns had come out and said, this is complete fiction, well, I would have taken that very seriously indeed. He hasn't done that. He's left it to the spokespeople, middle level officials, people who are probably unfamiliar with the key decisions, and who can come forward, give denials, and give those denials honestly, because they're only repeating what they've been told, which they have no reason to doubt is true. But of course, if Burns goes on the record and denies something which is true, then he would be lying. And if he's denying something which, like this Nord Stream operation, which Hersh has described and which appears to have been illegal under US law, well, he would be compounding that illegality, and he might be in serious trouble if he were to deny something like that untruthfully. So I think it is indicative that he hasn't spoken, and that makes me think, and that makes me even more certain that Hersh's account is largely true. Now, there have been some criticisms of Hersh's article from some people. I have to say, in one or two cases, I think there's a slight element of jealousy. But, you know, some of the people, I think, are being a little bit more constructive in their criticisms. There's been some suggestions that there's been some mistakes, that Hersh hasn't fully understood all the movements of ships and things of that kind. I don't think that has any real importance, to be frank. The most substantive criticisms that I've seen, and the ones that I take most seriously and which I think are probably correct, are the ones that have come again from Helmer. And Helmer makes, I think, what is undoubtedly a valid point, which is that Hersh, relying on his source or sources, there appear to be two, one which has corroborated another, that Hersh assumes that a more narrow circle of people were involved in this affair than perhaps were, by which I mean that Hersh focuses very much on the decision-making in the United States and the bypassing of Congress, and talks about the fact that Norway, or that the Norwegian authorities played the central role in carrying out this operation in support of the United States. That it was the United States that carried out the central role, but the Norwegians were the most actively complicit. But that undoubtedly, and I think about this Helmer is probably right, other officials in other European governments, in Germany specifically, but undoubtedly in Britain, in Poland probably, in Denmark quite possibly, Sweden quite probably, that they were also at some level briefed and were at least involved in the sense that they either confirmed their support for this operation or perhaps even provided some helping it in some way. And I think this is probably true. And the country to focus on here is Germany, because this was an attack not just on a Russian pipeline to Germany, but also on a pipeline in which the Germans had a major financial stake and, of course, a big economic interest. It was their pipeline as much as it was Russia's. So it is very important indeed, or so it seems to me, if there were Germans also involved. Now, having said that, that of course begs the question, which Germans? Well, that Scholz was involved. I don't dispute that possibility at all, though I don't think so. I don't think the United States fully trusts Scholz. This is my own personal view. At least I don't think they trusted Scholz at the time when, according to Hirsch, the planning for this operation began in earnest, which was in December 2021. I might be wrong about that. It may be that Scholz was briefed during that visit to Washington and gave the green light. I think that would be an extraordinary thing if he did that. Probably career destroying if it ever came out. But, well, who knows? But quite plausibly, other German officials were involved, and one has to wonder whether Habeck and Baerbock, the two most important Green ministers, both outspoken critics of Nord Stream from long before the present conflict, whether they weren't at least briefed in some way. Now, the question is, what is the general attitude going to be about this affair in Europe? That this story has been a massive embarrassment is shown by, in my opinion, one thing. Firstly, the British media has almost ignored it. I did an experiment. I typed in the names of some British newspapers and then typed in Seymour Hersh, Nord Stream, and did internet searches, and they came out with nothing. Some British media outlets have completely ignored this whole affair. The London Times published an article about it, but it was up for a very short time. I can only find it because there are still live links to it, and I do wonder whether it appeared only in the American edition. I believe that an article in the Daily Mail only appeared in the American edition. I might be wrong about that. But anyway, the British media overall has basically ignored this story. And I get the sense that this is true of the European media in general and the German media in particular. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people, especially in Germany, who aren't very concerned and very angry about this thing. Now, there are probably a range of reactions in Germany, especially the German business community, about this affair. It could be, and I'm talking now about German business people, that the predominant view amongst these German business leaders is that they might have been saying to themselves, well, we underestimated the depth of American opposition to Nord Stream, and this is something that we need to be careful about in future, because Germany's future is in a strong alliance with the United States, and that might make us more careful about getting close to the Russians in the future. So, there could be that way of thinking in Germany as well. But I can't help but think that there are going to be at least some German industrial interests who are going to be saying to themselves, well, here we see the United States, it's prepared to launch attacks against our critically important energy infrastructure. It's caused massive damage to our economy, massive long-range damage to our economy. What kind of a friend is this? Now, that may be a minority view, but I'm sure that view exists and it might take hold. And when I say German business interests, Germany's powerful unions, there might be people who are thinking about those sort of things as well. And they, of course, carry traction within the SPD, the party of Olaf Scholz, which is, of course, the lead party in the German coalition. So, over time, I think that we might see that Seymour Hersh's article is one of those long-term bombs. It might not have an immediate impact, but especially if there is a military collapse by Ukraine at some point in the next few weeks or months, and Ukrainian officials are now openly saying that it might be very, very difficult for them to resist this huge Russian force that's being gathered against them. Well, if there's a collapse in Ukraine, that might bring out all of these arguments and all these complaints about the attack on Nord Stream to the surface. In Germany, it might also do the same in the United States. I can see the makings here of a titanic row, and quite plausibly a row in the country that may ultimately matter most here, which is Germany itself. Now, saying all of this isn't a prediction, it's just a possibility. But the fact that there seems to be such an effort being made to silence Seymour Hersh's article is further proof, at least further evidence, that it's almost certainly, in all its essentials, true, and that it is a truth that is extremely embarrassing and could blow things apart. Now, let me just finish by going back to this quarrel now between Olaf Scholz and Annalena Baerbock. They're said to no longer be on speaking terms. Apparently, Scholz has found out and is very angry about Baerbock having consultations behind his back with people like Blinken and others over tank deliveries. Of course, if he finds out that Baerbock was in secret discussions with US officials, and we come back to what Helmer says, that some German officials were probably in on the secret. If Scholz finds out that Baerbock was one of them and was intriguing with the Americans to blow up Nord Stream 2, and at a time when Scholz himself might have been kept out of the loop, well, I can't see how their relationship can survive. Just saying. So let's wait and see how this plays out. As I said, it may be a bomb with a very long fuse, but at some point it might detonate, and then perhaps the effects might be substantial. Well, this is where I stop today. Another long video, I'm afraid, but complex issues to discuss. More from me soon, and we'll see what happens in Bakhmut. Just to remind you again, you can find all our videos on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop and buy the great things you will find there. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. and have a very good day.